All right. So inverse functions, we're going to get into them, but basically it's the idea of doing the exact opposite of a function. So our objective is to determine, will be to determine inverse functions. That's super broad. I guess our goal should be to understand what an inverse function is. For this one, I feel like they could have made this a little bit better, but we can also figure out what an inverse function is. So the easiest way to think of an inverse function is thinking about it this way. Let me put my pen out here. Let me sign in for my pen. All right. Yeah, sign in. Hey, Arthur. And you're meeting with Miss Anish went a little late. In case you guys were curious at what the question is, you guys came a little late. The question is, what 5 items would you take with you during a zombie apocalypse? And why? If you guys don't want to do the full 5 items for the zombie apocalypse, that's fine. Do whatever you can. When I was typing these out, I think I was stuck with these 3, and then I'm like, oh, weapon and backpack afterwards. I didn't explain why, so I don't expect you guys to have to. Oh, you don't have to apologize. It's fine. All right. So let's get back into the easiest way to think of an inverse function. Did I not sign in? I did not. Yes, I did. Thank you for reminding me. Thank you. That way you guys have access to the video later. Thanks for reminding me. The easiest way to think of a function is this idea that a function is kind of like a machine. So here's our function. And our function normally takes an x and spits out a y. An inverse function is this idea of like if a number, it would treat a number as if it was a y. It goes into the function and spits out an x. So it's literally backwards. So for example, if I have something like y equals 3 times x, an inverse function, and remember function notation would technically be like this, an inverse function, and we use it with little exponent symbol. I don't know why we use this symbol, the -1, but that's what we do. So an inverse function would be something like 1/3 of x, meaning that if, let's say I had a 2, for example, if I put my 2 through my function, I would get out a 6. So if I threw it through this function f of x, this f of x function, but if I took that same 6 and put it through my inverse function, what happens is I have to take 1/3 of 6. So I'm dividing it by 3, in other words. Remember, 1/3 of x is the same thing as x divided by 3. So I would end up getting that 2 again. So that's a good way of finding it out. So if you put a function inside an inverse, you end up getting what you get there. So I'm reading your guys' things. Gun. I always see people putting in gun for their zombie apocalypse things, but I'm like, eventually you run out of bullets. I'm sorry for those of you watching on YouTube later on. You're probably like, oh, I remember that question of the day. Or if you're taking this later on, you're like, what is this question of the day stuff? So here's the thing. So now so our warm-up exercise is just, we have to solve for k. So if we're solving for k, that means we have to do it in terms of b. So we want to get k by itself. So first things first, we have to simplify this. So when we simplify this, we get 3, -3 plus 7k. So that's 4k. If you guys still have trouble with negatives and positives, the easiest way to remember it is if you have 3 negatives and 7 positives. Oh, I hate doing it when it's a lot of numbers. 1, 2, oh. Darn it. I did this mistake with someone in tutoring too. I wrote one extra and she called me out on it. She's like, no, it should be this. And I'm like, oh, I accidentally did one extra. So we have 4 positives left. That's the easiest way to kind of think about it is negatives and positives cancel out. If you have 2 negatives together, -3 and -4, you're just going to end up having 7 negatives. Nothing canceled out. So when they're different, like if you have a positive and a negative, they kind of get themselves smaller. Other than that, let's keep going. So here, so we want to get that k by itself now that everything's simplified. So we're going to have to get rid of this 3, and it's a positive 3. So we're going to take that 3 away from both sides. So that 3 goes away, and we're left with 5b minus 3. And we're going to have to divide by 4 because right now we're multiplying by 4. So we end up getting k equals 5b minus 3, everything divided by 4. So that's how come they already put it to you in this nice little fraction notation. So when we're doing this, we would get this 5b minus 3, and we divide it all by 4. Now, on the warm-ups and everything, it's okay to just put your answer, but when you guys are doing this for your activities, just remember to show your work. You can do that with a picture or by submitting it. I'm going to submit that. Nice. All right, and now moving on to the next one. So again, intro videos you guys can watch on your own, but they do kind of like talk about it in a way of thinking about it. So sending a call is a function, receiving a call is an inverse. If you guys don't watch these, I do recommend them. I just don't do it because of class time restraints, but they are kind of a good way of kind of picturing functions and inverse functions. All right, inverse functions. A long-running popular game show asks contestants to come up with a question given the answer. So they're talking about Jeopardy. Jeopardy is kind of weird. Instead of them giving you a question, they give you an answer, and you have to make up a question for it. Usually, it's like, "What is this?" instead of just saying it. So it's an inverse. Instead of you saying a question and getting an answer, the inverse is they give you the answer and you have to say what the question is. So consider this. This is a formula that takes Celsius, we plug in a Celsius and we get out Fahrenheit. Well, what if we want to convert this Fahrenheit into Celsius? We would have to do a lot of work, or we can find what's known as the inverse. What they do here is they're trying to get this C by itself. So they're going to subtract the 30 from both sides, and then they have to get rid of this this fraction, this 9 over 5. So in order to get rid of 9 over 5, remember, the over 5 means we're dividing by 5. So they're multiplying by 5, and the 9 on the top means we're multiplying, so that means we're dividing. So even if you guys you wanted to do, you're like, how do I get rid of all of this? Just remember, this is the same thing as 9c over 5. It's the same thing, it's just written differently because it looks nicer it being on the side. So you can always get rid of this by multiplying everything by f minus 32. So if you multiply it, this goes away. And then you can also get rid of this times 9 right here, by dividing everything by 9. So whether you write it like this, or if you write it like this, they're both the same answer. I know a lot of people get confused with fractions, so you will see me doing that. I will say some stuff that seems repetitive, like when I talk about positives and negatives of fractions, just because in my experience, that's where people struggle the most. So I'm sorry if you guys hear me keep repeating it over and over. So the idea of a function in inverse function is it's the reverse. So it's this idea that if you start off with a function, it gives you a y, and if you plug in that y into an inverse function, it goes back into the original. So the key thing here, there's 3 steps to solving for 4 steps. I teach these all the time. Step 1 is turn f of x into y. Your next step is to switch your x and y. So switch x and y. So if you had something like f of x equals 3x, you're going to go y equals 3x. And then your next step is to solve for the new y. So solve for new y. They say it as solve for y to produce inverse function. Solve for your new y. So in order to do this, I'm going to have to switch these. I haven't switched them yet. X equals 3y. So I have to get this 3y by itself. So I have to divide by 3. So I get y equals x divided by 3. And the last step is change new y to f inverse of x. And remember, these parentheses don't mean times when we're talking about a function. It means of. It means this is our input. That x is our input. So let's actually practice this, or let's see it be practiced. So here's our function. First step, they replace it with y. Second step, they're going to switch their x and their y. Third step, now we're going to have to start solving for new y. So they added 11 to both sides. Then we have to get rid of this fraction. So they're doing what I do. I like getting rid of it one step at a time instead of flipping it over. So they're multiplying it by 7 on both sides. And then they're going to divide everything by 16. And now for our last step, we're going to take that y and turn it into f inverse of x. So you guys can always come back to this slide 11, and it'll help you out with it. All right, so let's see what we have here. So we're going to do our sequence. So our first step would be to replace this with y. All right, so that's this one right here. This is the exact same thing. Then our next step is to switch our x and our y. All right, so that's this one. Same thing, it's just our x and our y are different. Then we have to solve for y, meaning that we have to get rid of this plus 9. We want to get this y, we want to isolate this y, get it by itself. We're going to take away 9 from both sides. That's this, we're left with the fraction. Then we're probably going to want to get rid of this -4 by multiplying by -4. Now, here's the thing I don't like about Edmentum. It's always inconsistent. They just taught us to multiply by -4 and then divide by 3. They're going to be like, oh, multiply by -4 and divide by 3 at the same time. It's cool. But they just taught us to do the other way. So I don't blame you if you guys get confused. The reason why it works doing it this way is because the 4's cancel, the negative cancels out with the negative. Negative times the negative is a positive, and the 3 cancels out with the 3. So they kind of skipped a step there, and I'm not a big fan of them doing that. I don't know why they always do that, but they do, and I hate it. So we're going to multiply this by the reciprocal. We flip it upside down. From here, we can supposedly end it, but they want us to actually distribute this. So if we distribute it, we end up getting -4x divided by 3. And since this is a negative times a negative, we're going to get positive 9 times 4 is 36, and we're going to divide that by 3. So from there, we end up getting this 12. So they are skipping a few steps here. I'm not a big fan of that. So if you guys ever have trouble with these, let me know. Sometimes Edmentum just is dumb, and I won't mark you off for it because we all need help from time to time. Last step, change it to inverse. Is this making sense to everybody? Like how to do it? I don't want you guys see you guys just putting the tiles in randomly. Cool. All right. So that's slide 12. So let's look at this. So here they're talking about how to solve for this. So if our f of x is this, how do we figure out what our x is? So we would just plug in this f of x into for y. So what they're saying is f of x is this. This is f of x. So just replace it. That's all that's going on there. Another way of doing this is we can ask ourselves what the inverse function of 4 is. And you'll see it right here. So they're like, oh, well, f of x is y, okay? And we can do this, and they solve. So this is our inverse function. They're going to show us right here. So in other words, this is what I don't like doing. They're like, okay, cool. So g of x is our inverse. Not the biggest fan of calling it g of x because then you have to be told that this is your inverse. So now it's saying this. F of x is the inverse of x, or inverse of f. So like I said, they have to tell you that's the inverse. Which of the following solutions for every xy solution of g of x swap with xy, blah, blah, blah. In other words, in function g, the value of y is the value of x. This is super confusing. It's just saying that if you have a y going into your g, it's going to spit out an x. It's treating, so this is an inverse. So even though you would technically still call this an x, it's treating it like a y and it spits out an x. So it's g of x, but think of it more as like g of y. It takes a y and spits it out. Remember, these are just letters. They don't mean anything until we give them meaning. So when we're talking about this, it's kind of treating it as if it's a y, even though it's calling it an x. Oops, that's not what I meant to do. The next thing we're going to do here is we're going to plug in a 4 here for our f of x. Now, if we plug that into this, we plug in a 4 here, we get a half. All right. So then they're going to be like, okay, so the function of 1/2 gives us 4, but the inverse, if we plug in a 4, we get 1/2. So it gives us the opposite. So we plug in an x here, it gives us a y. So our x is 1/2, and our y is 4. And this one, we plug in an x, but it treats it like a y, so it's going to spit out that 1/2. Does that kind of make sense? I know this one's a little weird. It basically does backwards. So if you put in a 1/2 in here, which I don't know why they did this, is so confusing. They should have just said, because we just learned about this, they should have just said f of 1/4 gives you 4. F inverse of 4 gives you 1/2. That would have been the best way to do it. If we plug in a 4, we get 1/2. But in the original function, if we plug in a half, it gives us a 4. All right, so let me put this as unanswered. They want us to graph this. So plot the corresponding points. All right, this shouldn't be anything new. So when we're doing this, we're going to get our point, -1, 1. -1, up 1, 0, 2. So we're at 0. We go up to 2. We're at 1. We go to 3. 2. We go to 4. Easy peasy. That's our regular function. What? Use the drawing tools correspond. Inverse function. That's what I get for not reading. Inverse. So remember how I said it treats it backwards? Well, this is what I was talking about. It wants us to treat it like an inverse function. Let me try again. So in other words, even though this is normally our y, we're talking about the inverse. So it's going to treat it like an x. So this 1, we're going to treat it like an x. So we're going to go positive 1, negative 1. So I graphed the actual function. This is telling me to graph the inverse function. So I'm going to go to 2, 0. So 2 and 0. And I'm going to go to 3, 1. So I'm going backwards. And then I'm going to go to 4, 2. So this would be my inverse function. So if you notice, it's kind of what I graphed before. It's a mirror image about this line. Because where was I? It looked like this before. And the reason why it looks like a mirror image is because this line is where y is the same as x. So it's a mirror image where y is the same as x. You guys don't need to know that, but it will help you when you start geometry, understanding how to reflect. So it was a reflection. So now I'm going to submit this and it should be fine. Yeah. You have to treat them backwards because it's talking about an inverse. An inverse flips your x's and y's. All right. So here's our line here. It wants us to do the inverse using these tools. Well, the easiest way to do this is I'm going to figure out what this point is. And then I'm going to figure out what this point is over here. So this point is, the top point is 6, negative 6, comma 6. Negative 6, comma 6. And this other point, the one I did in red, or I guess orange, is negative 2, comma negative 5. Well, if I want to graph the inverse, my inverse for this one would be 6, comma negative 6. And my inverse for this one would be negative 5, comma negative 2. So let me plot those. So I'm going to grab my first point, and I'm going to graph it at, where is it? 6, comma negative 6 down here. And then I'm going to graph my other point, negative 5, comma negative 2, put that here. I'm going to delete these. Now that I have those 2 points, since it's a straight line, I don't have to graph every single point on that line. I just have to graph these 2 points. For this one, I made the mistake. Remember, click it with one finger, drag it with the other finger if you're using a laptop. If you don't like doing that, you can always grab a mouse, click, and drag. And there you go. So let's see if I read the instructions right this time. I did. So there we can see this is an inverse. And again, if I drew a line right here, it would be like a mirror. This mirrors all the way. Ooh, I can't draw a straight line apparently. But you get the idea. It kind of flips over. If you had a piece of paper and folded it over this spot right here, it would fold over this way. This spot is also going to fold over here. Okay. And as always, guys, I'll have this video going on YouTube soon. I think I still need to put yesterday's videos for the other classes up. All right. So that's pretty much it. As always, guys, I always want you to read the summary or watch it if it's a video. This always goes over all the steps of inverse functions. So it was a short class today. So I kind of want to do something that I did in my other class. I'll stop the recording. I kind of want to get to know you guys a little bit better.